The next case study or concept or social structure we will look at is the idea of science. So just like there's faith, right?
Yeah.
There's belief, and then there's knowledge and scientific knowledge. But scientific knowledge has its institutions.
Yeah.
It's universities, but it's also, in this case, museums. And one of my favorite examples, if not the best example that I know of in terms of the Museum of Science as an artwork, is David and Diane Wilson's Museums of Jurassic Technology in LA. And when they started this place in the 1980s, they started in an almost derelict building. They bought it for almost nothing. And David Wilson basically had studied science, but then he went to study film at CalArts.
Yeah.
And he was like, he tried to make films, but then he realized, I'm making all these films about science museums. I really want to have a museum.
I didn't know this.
Yeah, so why don't I just start a museum? So he started this museum, and last year, over like 30,000 people come through this museum now.
I do, every year.
Yeah, I go there religiously, you know,
Yes.
and the displays are so well done that the stuff is absurd sometimes, but it's so well done that you really want to believe in the science of it. Yeah.
The name says it all.
And the explanation, it tells like it's dedicated to the concept and of the Jurassic, of the medium Jurassic, And so the whole aesthetic of how science shares its messages is what's, it's a museum about museums. And something I love about it too is that if you actually go back even to the history of art museums, like art and science were merged together. They were part of these institutions that housed like what we call cabinets of curiosity,
Absolutely.
right? And so that's what Wilson is after in this institution.
Yeah, and it's funny because our two examples actually literally live next door to each other in Culver City, Los Angeles. So if you go to the Museum of Jurassic Technology, the more stark iteration is next door, and they're called the Center for Land Use Interpretation. And this organization, studied by a man named Matthew Coolidge, basically studies the uses of the American landscape, and specifically American landscape. And under the auspices of this kind of dry studies of the uses of land, which in fact is all inspired by Robert Smithson, the artist who did all this land art stuff from the 60s and 70s, they are interested in studying everyday phenomena, from the history of film sets in Los Angeles to the study of artificial caves in America, to the study of what is worth sightseeing in America. Mm-hmm. So under the kind of use of studying the world, they actually become a kind of cultural lens to understand the world we're in. And they're amazing.
And before we're talking about the powerful, so and whether there are artists among the powerful.
Yeah.
What do you think, Nato? Is Walt Disney an artist, or is Disney Corporation an artist?
Yeah, it's a good question.
The reason I ask is because one of these, we're moving into this section which is our last section in this module, of what some people call intentional communities, or the whole idea of our living space, our entire community, our social mesh as the social structure. Like the places where we live, where we share, hallways, but also where we go shopping, where we eat, all our everyday life happens in communities, right?
Yeah.
And so Disney actually started one of the, to many people, most radical, intentional communities, although intentional communities tends to be used only for radical experiments, meaning on the left, progressives, but for Disney it was Celebration, this town that they founded, where basically it was modeled after all of the ideals of the Disney family, the Disney structure, right next to Disney World, and it's still running, and there's more and more people have moved to Celebration. So we have everything from that type of spectrum to Drop City, the kind of an outgrowth that organized by students. Drop City between the 60s and the 70s was an active community with all these geodesic domes inspired by Buckminster Fuller, where these artists from the University of Kansas, but also from Colorado Boulder, they wanted to make a community as an artwork. So their houses were made of discarded metal from cars, but in these domes. They were all inspired by Black Mountain College. There's another radical experiment in living. So we can go from the corporate version of the community to the experimental artistic avant-garde version, to the grassroots farmer communities like Zapatista autonomous villages, right? Who at one point say, the state will not listen to us. We have our own methods of farming, our own methods of elections, etc., and we have tried consistently for the state to recognize them. But instead, we are giving up. So not only did they put on ski masks, but they created what they call autonomous communities. And they meant it. Autonomous meant we do not obey to the state.
Yeah.
Because the state will not obey its citizens.
You know, just to say, I don't know if you know, I grew up in a commune.
No.
I did.
Wow.
For 4 years. But where I was getting hardwired.
Does it still exist? Many communes
No, it doesn't
disappear.
exist.
Yeah.
And I have a hankering for this kind of working, because, you know, a lot of our references will be 60s and 70s. But you don't have a lot of artistic references in the contemporary era as much.
Right.
And escaping out of the neoliberal model seems to be tougher. And I think Zapatismo is certainly a huge inspiration for this.
Well, and while this is not the topic of our module now, but we'll definitely cover it in other sections of our MOOC, you're right in that many, on the one hand, we could grow nostalgic for these models of alternative communities in the 50s and 60s, even into the 70s, although we have to remember, a lot of them went quite dark in the 70s. And perhaps as an ending example, even if it leaves us on a very low note, we should bring up the Jonestown Massacre.
The Kool-Aid.
Don't drink the Kool-Aid. You know where that expression comes from?
Yeah.
You know, Jones, the leader of Jonestown, this really radical, actually quite leftist religious community, their leader went mad and convinced all these people. It was hundreds of people who committed suicide. One of the 2 largest collective suicides in human history happened in Jonestown in the 70s.
But wait, we cannot end on a low note.
Okay.
Because I always think people go to a dark place when they think of these communes and stuff.
It's true, yeah.
And I think it's important to say historically, there's been a lot of good that have come out of these things too.
Yeah.
Because I was talking to a curator friend of mine, Rashida Bumbre, who was saying if you look at a lot of the black radical separatist communities, a lot of amazing hip hop stars and radicals have come out of that history.
Well, even many of the things that we take for granted in our standard way of living now, they came from these radical movements, you know? How the family is organized, you know. It wasn't only feminism and the gay movement, these kind of what we would think of as homogenous, you know, structured, you know, social movements. It was actually entire radical living. People who just decided to live differently. They half the time didn't even know why, but we've taken what was best of their experiments and put it into our everyday life. Right? What you were just listening to were the national anthems of Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, and Ireland, all sung simultaneously, but in the language of the next country in the alphabet. No country sings their anthem like that, and no citizen of the world does so either. For this week's assignment in this MOOC, you are to invent your own country or church or corporation and represent it in a way that you think works best. Then you're going to invite others to join that group, whether it's a country, corporation, or church, and have an experience together. Have fun. The worldwide flash mob option for this module has to do with institutions. We want to work within institutions or in relation to institutions that we care about. Someone famously once said that when faced with an institution, you should ask yourself, is this something that needs to be reformed, or is it something that needs to be abolished? When I get invited by an institution to do something, I do ask myself that question. If it's an institution that I think should be abolished, then I simply don't work with them, right? Why would you want to relate to an institution that needs to be abolished? But most institutions, perhaps all institutions that I know of, that I actually, even the ones that I love, can use a little bit of reform. They can always improve. So in a week, in a module, when we're thinking about social transformations, but the very structures that give social forms their cohesion in everyday life, we want to think about how we may transform those collectively. And the flash mob assignment is supposed to do that. So begin by thinking of an institution that you deeply care about. You may not understand entirely why, but you have to feel like you care about it. And then start analyzing what your relationship to that institution is. You then will think of something that you want to transform in that institution and invite others to do so with you. What medium you use to do that is entirely up to you. If the institution is your local store, then it may not be necessary to use social media or even the telephone. You could just get a word-of-mouth campaign going. But if you're trying to change the IMF or the World Bank, well, you may as well start your Facebook account. Welcome to The Art of the MOOC, Merging Public Art and Experimental Education. My name is Pedro Lesh. Socially engaged artists can be extraordinary communicators, educators by training or vocation. Using varied technologies and social forms, some of the works we will study in this module set out to transform educational institutions from within, while others intentionally place themselves outside them as self-organized platforms. Whether art is being made or studied is not necessarily relevant. What matters is the production of alternative communities of learning, often challenging the hierarchies, professionalization, homogenization, and the debt mechanisms of our current education systems. In his book, An Education for Socially Engaged Art, artist and educator Pablo Helguera addresses the importance of education and the history of pedagogy for these new forms of cultural production. From Paulo Freire's very influential practice of the pedagogy of the oppressed to the present day. He also stresses the role of dialogue in recent pedagogical movements, something that is echoed in the social arts sphere by what one of its main theorists, Grant Kester, has even termed dialogical art, a new form of art practice that is premised on conversation and exchange. But how do we move from the top-down lecture format, or artist-audience relationship, to the more horizontal dialogue formats advocated by both Helguera, Kester, and so many socially engaged artists who care about education? As head of a country, the late president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, also became the host of his own very long-duration weekly TV show. Called Aló Presidente, it included a book club, discussions, conversations, entertainment, and more. Much like Oprah's show would, or the US Hispanic Sábado Gigante and its hugely successful model show Siempre en Domingo that ran for several decades before it. Joseph Beuys was famously expelled from his teaching post in Germany when he insisted that everyone can be an artist and all those who wanted could join his course. None of these cases are brought up as positive or negative examples, simply as clear manifestations of what we will call a radical opening of the roles and function that were considered to be exclusive or closed. In this case, the role of the president, the professor, or the artist. There could be many other functions, but what matters here is the idea of a radical opening, of taking a structure, a figure, a role, and opening it so that others can participate, people who had previously been excluded. While some may dismiss these particular efforts as demagogy or paradoxical grandstanding, it is unquestionable that many experiments in radical education and socially engaged pedagogy have stressed the importance of such an opening, even if they disagree on the best ways to accomplish it. On a very different side of the spectrum, for example, are those who did not want to rely on massive gatherings held by patriarchal voices, such as that of the president. I am talking about feminist activists, artists, and educators around the world in the 1960s and onwards, student movements, etc. These often began to focus their attention on masses of small gatherings and consciousness raising groups, what some later have called activist or cultural cells. Woman House, a project from 1972, is a great example of this, and influential to this date. It was founded by Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro through the CalArts Feminist Art Program in Valencia. The house was 17 rooms turned into a big installation, an old Hollywood mansion. Only women came on the first day, and over 100 visitors saw the installation. Participants included Faith Wilding and Mira Shore, and many other artists who've since become known as key artists of the feminist movement.
Waiting. Waiting for someone to come in. Waiting for someone to hold me. Waiting for someone to feed me.
Added to these critical approaches have also come those by artists and educators who have embraced new technologies, such as this very MOOC, to increase access to education, but also to increase access to the production of knowledge. Whether what is produced is artistic or not doesn't necessarily matter.
This is the first of 4 programs in which I want to question some of the assumptions usually made about the tradition of European painting. That tradition which was born about 1400, died about 1900. Tonight, it isn't so much the paintings themselves which I want to consider as the way we now see them, now in the second half of the 20th century, because we see these paintings as nobody saw them before.
John Berger's foundational Ways of Seeing, for example, was actually started as a TV show for the BBC in 1972. But also, some of the earliest online bulletin boards and self-organized social media platforms like Rhizome and NetTime were actually founded and run by artists. Last but not least, we have educational theories and experiments that are so radical in nature and so outside of official institutions that while they have no direct connection with art and artists, they end up being embraced or associated with them. Among major examples of these, we can find the Universidad de la Tierra, led by Gustavo Esteva in Oaxaca, a school committed to reclaiming and regenerating the conditions in which indigenous people traditionally have learned in their own ways. The didactic and political events held by the Zahmat Collective in India are another great example. The collective was founded in 1989 in response to the murder of political activist, actor, playwright, and poet Safdar Hashmi. Their work has been defined in part by their great resistance and stance against the threat of religious fundamentalism and sectarianism. The Caracoles Zapatistas in Chiapas are another fantastic example. But there's also, of course, the influential ideas elaborated by Ivan Illich in his book, Deschooling Society, a work from 1971. Now, our guest presenters have themselves been key figures in a number of approaches we have covered here. So we hope you will keep learning from them and also look near you for what you consider to be examples and practices of education that are so powerful that we may consider them a form of social art in their own terms. Welcome back to the Art of the MOOC. This part of our MOOC should be especially exciting because we're going to make art together. So let's start. Each week, remember, you will have two options to choose from: a social method option or a worldwide flash mob option. Depending on the week, you may choose one or the other. You don't always have to feel like you're a social person, you will do the flash mob, or you're an introspective person, therefore you will do the other option. Just pay attention to the materials in the lecture and then be intuitive about it, but also remember to challenge yourself and the people around you. Generally speaking, our social methods are about using social structures in our immediate surroundings as the very material of your artwork. The flash mob, on the other hand, tends to imply reaching out to others, whether it's in your immediate city or town, but even online, and then create these very fast, provocative events. For this module, as a social method option, we're encouraging you to do what one may call an anti-lecture. Each one of you will have to think about an assignment that you experienced in your educational past, an assignment that you felt was incredibly antisocial. It may even be an assignment that you learned a lot from, but one where you felt like you were forced into this position of antisocial existence. Why would we want to focus on that? There are many traditions within education, beginning with this idea, the dictum of know thyself, that are premised on the idea of introspection and individualist knowledge. It should not come as a surprise that in a MOOC on social practice and public art, that we would want to challenge this notion of introspection and individualism. We don't necessarily mean that this is a bad thing, but for us to create social knowledge, we need to also learn to turn educational ideas into a social form. And so we're asking you to go back to that moment in time, that particular assignment you had in your past, and think, how can I turn that into a social project, into a social assignment, something that will require me to work with other people to resolve that very same question, to reach that knowledge. Whether it was a math problem, a chemistry problem, some type of history question, none of that really matters. It should matter to you and to those who you invite to participate in the social process.
Hello everyone. For this week's project, you will all be doing a special collaboration with one of our guest presenters, Cesare Petroiusti. It's the only project that students will be doing in the entire MOOC that is proposed by our guest presenter. And we're calling it a mass drawing experiment. It's basically a flash mob, but in the form of a drawing that then gets posted on the Coursera platform. So Cesare, can you tell students how they can make this project?
Yes, it is very simple. It's going to be very simple. You only have to make a drawing on a 20 by 20 centimeter paper, and you can use any technique, and it can take as long as you want. The only condition is that the drawing you're going to make will be unfinished, incomplete.
And once you won't be finished with the drawing, because the assignment is that you should not finish that. But whenever you think it's in a good state of unfinishedness, you will scan it or photograph it and post it on the Coursera platform. And it's the evaluators in our peer evaluation process who will complete the drawing. They will conclude it, they will finish it, and it's at that point that we will post it collectively to the Coursera platform and see what has happened. Because we are making the work together, we're not only judging it together, right? And this is something that this mass drawing exercise will do. So have fun.
Good. Very good job.